One thing that you didn't mention was infrastructure.
Yeah.
And, as we know, key to competitiveness and productivity, infrastructure is a very, very important element of it. And it's pretty clear to, living in a major city. I'm from Melbourne, by the way. So that we need a lot of money spent on various areas of infrastructure, particularly transport. Funding, it's going to be a big issue because I think, as you pointed out, terms of trade are going to drop. I think there's going to be a huge revenue problem for the federal government. So I've got two questions really on the funding side of things. One, we hear the rhetoric that deficits are bad, and yet I don't think they are bad if the money is being borrowed to fund productive assets, and I think that distinction doesn't seem to be made by politicians. And secondly, we have got a great pool of assets, courtesy of the Keating Superannuation Guarantee Levy, all of whom are interested as investors in infrastructure assets, mature assets. I think government sort of needs to take the initial construction risk. So they're the two questions, really. What are you going to do on those two fronts to address the very significant funding needs that this country needs for infrastructure to maintain its competitiveness?
Thanks. It's a good question. The first point we've made on infrastructure at the federal level is we want to create greater certainty around the pipeline of projects that might be coming. So we want to have something like a 15-year rolling program of projects with proper business cases, transparent, published cost-benefit analyses and all the rest of it, drawing a bit of a contrast with the way the National Broadband Network was conceived and implemented and is being executed even as we speak. So part of what we want to do is reform the role of Infrastructure Australia to give it that broader role. We're conscious that Infrastructure Australia have identified a lot of assets around the place, particularly at the state level, that could be sold, brownfields assets, which could in turn release a lot of potential state capital for use on better infrastructure. Because if you go to the public, most of the research tells you they're a bit suspicious of asset sales and privatisation. They think it's code for prices going up or whatever. But if you can persuade them that the crown jewels or the perceived crown jewels that you're selling over here can actually be used for a better purpose over here, and it goes to your argument about the use of the funds, people are prepared to buy that. So one role for the Commonwealth is how it facilitates the states doing more of the asset sales that are available at that level, which in turn releases capital which can be used for infrastructure. And we would encourage the states to use it for capital purposes, obviously. Now, Andrew Robb in the last election pushed this idea of a potential tax break for infrastructure borrowings, and I think he also had in mind something that could be encouraging to the super funds. And I think he's looking at whether there's something more that can be done in that area, and any feedback on that in terms of the capital market issues, I'm happy to take that. But a couple of other points. We talk about the fact that there's a backlog of infrastructure, and there is, but let's make sure we know what that backlog really is, because often it's the case that we don't sweat our existing infrastructure enough before we start building new infrastructure. And what do I mean by that? Are we using existing infrastructure as efficiently as we can? Are we using the funding mechanisms available in existing infrastructure as well as we can? For example, the F3 M2 motorway, which we're now contemplating to link up to the Central Coast, that in part will be paid for by tolls on other parts of the system, etc., etc. And that's an important breakthrough, actually, because we're used to tolls on particular roads, but this is a case of cross-subsidisation in a way, but there'll be a toll there. And what surprised me, actually, pleasantly surprised me, because I was a bit worried about the reaction on the Central Coast. They saw the need for the infrastructure and they're prepared to pay something for it. So part of the funding mechanism will have to be pricing and tolls as well. And I think we've got to encourage that where that's feasible. I'm not aware of what we've done internally around better identifying the sharing of risk between the public and the private sectors in some of the projects. There's been talk internally, particularly in the context of public-private partnerships, who bears what risk, as you were alluding to before. But certainly, because most of this action is at the state level, we want to work with the states to improve the way they do things. and where possible have whole of government approaches to prioritising infrastructure. One of the issues here in New South Wales has been the relationship between what Infrastructure New South Wales does and what big departments like Transport do, and how you in effect merge the priorities to get, in this case, proper whole of state priorities. So I think there's a fair bit of work to be done there. I think also we should be linking our infrastructure policies more to the whole supply chain issue and efficiency in the supply chain between where, for example, in the case of mining, the mines are, what you need to build to get stuff to port, and the timing at which the Commonwealth or or government steps in to build stuff in anticipation of where development might go. In the case of the second Sydney airport, which is a major potential piece of infrastructure, again, at this stage, probably no decision from anybody till after the election. If I were putting my cards, on the table, look, we've got to make sure we're using the existing airport as efficiently as possible. I think that's one thing, and then have sufficient lead time to then build, if you need a second one, in time to have it to take some of the strain off the first one, so that there's if you can, a seamless transition. If I'm putting on a political hat, one of the benefits I see potentially of another airport at some stage in the Sydney Basin is that it also becomes a major locus for jobs in those particular areas, right? We talked a bit about unis and how they can be regional growth drivers. Airports can be a bit like that too, because of all the ancillary stuff which then they potentially attract. So you've got to take account of all of that, but don't quote me on that.
Okay, up the back, yeah, and then Josh, you're next. Just wait for the mic there. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Arthur, I'm very heartened by a lot of what you had to say, but what you didn't say is what bothers me. If I think about the period pre-2007 and the period post-2007, and I talk to my clients about it, the elephant in the room is that they now view Australia as a country that's moved from one that's relatively benign in terms of country risk to one where there's a high level of country risk. And they associate that country risk with uncertainty and the continuing changing of the rules and a lack of vision about what the country's really trying to achieve. So I guess I've two questions. One, what is the vision that the Liberals have for Australia? And I'm not asking about what do you consider urgent. I'm asking what do you consider important that transcends the election cycle? Because you won't get it done in 3 years. You won't get it done in 6 years. It may take you 9 years to move the needle where it needs to be moved. So we know what we're going from, but what are we going to? And the second question is, if you can answer that, then you can answer the question about the value chain. Because then when you start to look at the value chain, you say, how do we use the resources that we have to create jobs in this country rather than simply exporting to create jobs in other countries?
No, both good questions. On the first question, visions are very personal things. If Tony was here, the one thing he'd say about vision is, well, part of his job is to help every Australian achieve their own vision. I can only tell you what I spoke about in my maiden speech, which by definition was my first opportunity to say something publicly about why you're in public life and all the rest of it. And the point I made in that in that maiden speech was I believe in a bigger, more sustainable Australia. I want our population to be bigger, right? I want us to be a bigger country. I mentioned in a sustainable way because obviously that raises environmental and other challenges. But being bigger, I think, is important in terms of our market size. I think it's important in terms of our dynamism as a society, the benefits we get economically and culturally from those waves of migration, because most of it would come through migration. And geopolitically, we carry more clout. Sure, we can stay around where we are or slightly bigger and try and be the Switzerland of Asia and all the rest of it, but that's not going to cut it. We're sort of caught a bit in the middle here, and I think we've got to make a decision. So for me, part of having a growth framework is about having a bigger Australia. And it's about having a global mindset that I talked about before, in terms of always recognising, right, that we don't live here in isolation. That's all gone. The old Australian settlement is gone, right? We're part of the region, particularly the Asian region, right? The thing about Asia is, if you go to people in Asia, they don't say, I'm Asian. They say, I'm Thai, I'm Indonesian, all the rest of it. So it's not a case of somehow we've got to change our identity, right? Our identity is evolving as we go, under successive waves of immigration and change. So what I'm saying is, bigger population is part of that, a global mindset, which also means that when it comes to issues like the openness of our borders, our capacity to attract capital, right? And these are all on balance things. On balance, we're more permissive of foreign capital coming here than being restrictive. And that has implications not just for things like Foreign Investment Review Board, but also the way we set tax, for example. And we recognise the mobility of factors of production. So it goes to the way the tax system recognises that unless you incentivise people here, people do have options that perhaps a few generations ago they didn't exercise, but they have them now. So that globalisation process, we've got to embrace it and manage it. See, part of the problem has always been that, and I hear this when people in Geelong sort of talk about what's happening there, and they're concerned about Target is now taking a certain number of jobs out of head office. I was down in Geelong last year after Ford were cutting some jobs in the plant. But people there were saying, well, wouldn't it be better if some of the assistance that's provided to motor industry and others was actually used to help SMEs develop? And I heard the Mayor of Geelong say the same thing today. But my point is this: we shouldn't wring our hands when structural adjustment is occurring. It's ongoing. It's whether you're a victim of it or you manage it. And one of the things I also said in that speech about the education system, well, two things actually. One was language. I think we've got to get back to appreciating the role of language, because it has fallen off in recent years, and a lot of governments on both sides have a responsibility for that, but we should be encouraging people to do language. Important for cognitive skills. It's also important in helping you to understand other cultures. We are great travellers as a country, but that doesn't mean we necessarily understand other people. And you've got to get inside their heads, I think, to do that. The second part of the education piece, somewhat more controversially, I suppose, in a way, was we don't actually teach people to be capitalists or entrepreneurs. Now, maybe you don't need to. People have either got the drive or they don't. But what I'm saying is, in everything we do and the way our education system is structured, we don't actually teach people a bit about what entrepreneurship is, what it means, what risk-taking is. You sort of learn that later, maybe when you get out of school, after you've imbibed all those other subjects. As I say, that's a somewhat more controversial thing. But I think that's important because it makes people understand what makes a place tick, why people do business and why business is important, without brainwashing people. It's a free society. People can hear all the arguments for and against the things business does, but understanding what business is about is, I think, important.